Hey team, Yasin here, and in this training, we're going to be going over the 7-step spice creation process. We're going to go ahead and walk through this step by step so you know exactly how to be able to create your spice frameworks that are really going to go ahead and make up a key piece of your spice and your messaging and your marketing and how all of that comes together. So we're going to be breaking this training up into multiple pieces and multiple sections so that way you can go ahead and follow along. So inside of this specific training, we're going to go ahead and talk about a quick overview about what the 7-step spice creation process actually is. Okay, now the reason why this is so important is because, like we've spoken about in other trainings, is that no aspect of the tactics, no aspect of kind of the tools that you're going to be learning throughout 100K Mastermind and throughout the 100K Income and Business training are going to work without the engine and without the spice, right? We've talked about this in previous trainings before about the importance of making sure that, hey, we're going to provide you the tactics. Hey, we're going to provide you the step-by-step. Hey, we're going to give you everything that you need. But on top of that, right, the tactics, that's kind of just the bottom line chassis of the vehicle, right? You're going to need kind of the bigger piece of this, which is, okay, hey, are you doing the study? And then the engine of all of this really is going to be the spice that you are able to go ahead and bring to the table. Okay, so at the end of the day, really the analogy that we're talking about when we talk about spice is that pretty much everyone in business has pretty much the same tools or the same tactics in order to make their basic meal, right? But here's the thing, it's your specific spice. It's that single ingredient, which is that spice that you add to your meal that really helps you stand out with your product, with your offer to your dream client, okay? But the big thing about this is that the spice creation process is honestly probably one of the biggest and most difficult things for a beginner to come up with. And that's the reason why we have this module structured the way that we do. In fact, the big reason why we ended up having difficulty with previous versions of this program, we would provide all the tactics, we give the step-by-step, we show exactly what to do. But the issue with all those students who weren't successful, right? We'd have a big portion of students who were successful, but the common theme and the common trend that we would see with those students who were not successful was because of the fact that they were missing their spice. And that really is the reason why a lot of beginners have difficulty in this coaching education market, is because they don't have anything unique to provide, okay? And so that's exactly the reason why we're going through this. And so what we've done is we've created a framework that you can follow step by step in order to actually come up with what we call your spice framework. And what we've done is we've actually broken down all of those steps into 7 specific steps when it comes to actually creating your spice framework. Okay, now what are those 7 steps? Those 7 steps are: number 1, deciding to serve. Number 2 is learning as well as sharing. Number 3 is finding patterns from multiple sources. Number 4 is creating your framework hypothesis. Number 5 is testing that framework hypothesis on yourself. Number 6 is all about proving that framework with others. And then number 7 is all about becoming the prolific expert of your proven framework. Now, a couple of things you're going to notice about this framework as you're going to go ahead and follow this over the next couple of trainings, that you are going to notice kind of the color scheme on this, right? We are very deliberate in the way that we design our own frameworks. And you can kind of think of this framework right here as like a framework to design frameworks. It's kind of like an interesting concept, right? It's kind of like that movie I always joke around about, Inception, that movie, which is like dreams within dreams, right? And so what you're going to notice is that the first 3 steps of this process, we've specifically colored green. Now, the reason why is because if you expect to become somebody who's going to be a leader, an expert, a guide, what that means is that you have to be able to provide value to others, right? You're going to provide so much value as a leader, as an expert, as a guide, that they're going to want to be willing to actually work closer with you. They want to actually be willing to hire you, and they want to purchase your products and your services because of how much value that you're able to provide even before they gave you a single dollar, right? So for you to be able to get to that point where you are over here, it does mean that there's going to be a tremendous amount of growth that you are going to have to go through. Because unless you go through that growth, unless you actually become somebody of value, only then, once you get to the end of this entire process, are you going to be able to provide and contribute massive amounts of value to other people, okay? And so really these 7 steps that we're about to walk you through throughout this training is what's going to allow you to no longer feel that imposter syndrome, because you've actually gone through the process of actually having your own spice. You're actually able to be an expert of something that is completely unique to you, your own frameworks, your own processes, and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's the reason why this section right here is probably one of the most, if not the most important sections of this entire framework. And then you can kind of build it from there going forward. Okay, so that is kind of the overview of what it looks like when we talk about this specific framework. Now, before we get into the actual training, I do want to also go ahead and give credit where credit is due. Now, this is very important for us because as you've seen the pattern throughout when you're going through certification is that really at the end of the day, we don't want to be the guru on the mountain who knows everything and who was born knowing everything. The reason we don't want to be that is because the truth is that that's a lie and it's unethical, right? The reason why we encourage so much for you not to be the student who expects to be spoon-fed, who expects to be a remote control student is because at the end of the day, we understand that, hey, there are many different teachers out there. There are many different ways to learn. And at the end of the day, I've always said this from the very beginning. I believe this is a quote from either Aristotle or Plato or somebody smarter like that who says, if I have seen further, it is because I stand on the shoulders of giants. That's an amazing quote that I always love, is that if I have seen further, meaning if I have accomplished more, if I've been able to, have some unique, amazing idea, if all of a sudden, I've had more success than anybody else has come before me, the reason is not because I was born that way. The reason is not because I'm some unique, magical, mystical creature. No, it's because we all stand on the shoulders of the giants that came before us, right? And so at the end of the day, your audience will always respect you more because you didn't steal ideas from others and you actually gave credit. Now, I know I'm spending a lot more time on this for this specific training. Now, this is going to be a theme you're going to see as we give credit to other people that we've learned from. I'm not going to spend this much time explaining it every single time, but the big thing I want you to know is that the 7-step spice creation process is really a compilation of things that we've learned and compiled over the years through many people that we've learned from. People like Todd Brown, Sam Ovens, Russell Brunson, Alex Hormozi, Dan Kennedy, the authors of Play Bigger, the authors of Blue Ocean Strategy. And then what we did is we took all of those learnings and we actually stress tested them in our own framework. And so that's why I wanted to go ahead and really give credit where credit is due inside of this specific overview. So with that being said, this was the overview. What we're going to go ahead and do now is we're actually going to go ahead and next talk about the steps of the framework as well as what the difference between frameworks and spice actually is. All right, team, welcome to this quick training on the difference between frameworks versus spice. Okay, now, if you know anything about our methodology and how we operate, you already know that we talk about, especially in certification, we've talked about the importance of actually defining words, right? We've talked about how words are just labeled thoughts. And so the clearer that you are in the words that you use, the clearer that you are going to be in the thinking and in the thoughts that you are having, okay? And so a common question that ends up coming up is students ask, hey, what's the difference between the framework, right? The spice framework that we're going to go ahead and create and like spice as a whole, okay? And the answer to that is that your spice is really what we call and what we define as something more than just your frameworks, okay? Like your frameworks are a big piece of that, but your spice is really made up of kind of the intangibles as well, right? The way that you speak, the energy and the vibe, the way that you teach, your personality, your authenticity, your terms, your vocabularies, your slogans, right? Your explanations, your branding, your unique mechanism, like all of these things are all underneath the umbrella of the spice that you bring, right? It's what makes you different. And a lot of that, a lot of times has to do with intangible things, right? But specifically what we're talking about in this series of trainings is the framework and the spice framework around kind of the pillar of your marketing. And then as well as the pillar of really your fulfillment and all of that is kind of your frameworks, right? And again, it's a big piece of your spice, but it's not necessarily everything, right? So even though it might be a big piece, it's not everything. And so just to show you a couple examples of what we talk about when we talk about frameworks, right? You might be like, hey, frameworks, what the heck is a framework? A framework is kind of like, another word for it is like a mental model, right? A framework is a way to think about kind of like an abstract concept, but then it's simplified specifically for people to understand, right? And it's really put together in a way that's a lot of times visual. We really love to put frameworks into visuals because people are naturally kind of visual learners. And so the big 4 areas of wellness, that is a framework, right? The 4 pillars of health, that's a framework, right? When we talk about the seasons of life, that is a framework, right? We talk about the wheel of wellness, the wheel of health. We talk about the results formula, right? So results equals skill plus identity, and then specifically skill equals knowledge times reps. And then also on top of that, we have the skills curve, right? All of these are examples of frameworks when we talk about, being able to communicate something, right? Now, there are going to be different types of frameworks that you use in your marketing, frameworks that you use in your fulfillment, different types of frameworks that you're going to be learning about. But I did want to just go ahead and give you an example of what frameworks are as a whole. Okay, so that is the quick training about frameworks versus spice. If you do have any questions, let us know in terms of understanding the terms and understand the vocabulary and kind of the difference between all of them. And sometimes it can seem a little bit abstract. This topic sometimes is a little bit more abstract, but I hope this helps clarify that so that way everybody can be on the same page. All right, team, spice messaging frameworks versus fulfillment frameworks. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So throughout this training, what's going to happen is you're going to be learning all about how to create a framework, right? We've already talked about that. We've talked about the overview, all of that kind of stuff. However, a big common confusion that sometimes happens with students is they ask, hey, do I need to create a framework for how my clients are going to get the results? Like, is that what I'm doing when I'm explaining my process, right? And this is where sometimes it gets a little bit confusing. And so we've kind of come up with the difference between spice messaging frameworks versus fulfillment frameworks. Okay, so let me go ahead and explain the really easy one first, which is the fulfillment frameworks. Okay, so remember all of those frameworks that we licensed to you during certification as you're going through that process, right? There were so many different frameworks that we went through, right? Imagine all of those images and all of those nice diagrams and all of that kind of stuff, right? When you were going through certification, right, there were so many of them that I can't even list all of them. I literally just had to take a screenshot of all of the different trainings and the modules, right? Remember, module 2 had the becoming process, and then the clouds were covering that process where hey, don't worry about the how, and then there was the 6 W's of becoming, and then there was the 6 W's of health, and then there was all these frameworks related to metabolism and all those images related to that. All of those things are what we refer to as fulfillment frameworks, okay? Those are all of the frameworks that you're using to explain the concepts around how they're actually going to get the result. You're actually explaining inside of those frameworks, whether you decide to use the ones we've licensed to you inside of certification, or you decide to come up with your own. Fulfillment frameworks are just explaining kind of like an abstract concept related to the result or related to the topic that you're actually kind of teaching, right? We've already gone through a lot of different fulfillment frameworks. Now, here's the thing. If you are planning on actually helping people with their health, right, or anything health related, then the big thing here is that there really is no reason for you to kind of go out there and reinvent a gazillion different frameworks already related to fulfillment. Now, obviously, you don't necessarily have to go out there and help people only with their health, right? You can help people health, wealth, relationships, connection to something greater, mindset, general life. There's all sorts of things that you could help someone with. However, if you're going to be helping them with something health related, then absolutely, that's the reason you went through certification and the reason why we licensed to you all of the different frameworks that we already have related to fulfillment. Right now, if you want to go out there and create some additional frameworks related to your fulfillment, maybe something you had an idea, you had a eureka moment, and you're like, you know what, I want to have something that's kind of a different framework related to health. Absolutely, you can add it in there. You can kind of have a mixed bag, right? Maybe 80 or 90% are the frameworks that we've licensed to you, and then maybe you have 5 or 10% of the frameworks that you're like, you know what, I want to kind of add this in there as well. By all means, right? And so that's the big thing I want to kind of mention here when we talk about fulfillment frameworks, is that when we learn about frameworks throughout the rest of this training and we talk about creating your framework, that does not mean that you have to go out there and all of a sudden create a gazillion different health frameworks. There's no reason for you to go out there and try and reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. And that's the reason you went through certification and have all of those health frameworks for you, right? But then the second part of this is now when we specifically talk about spice messaging frameworks, right? And that's where you have to kind of understand the difference between them, okay? So we talk about the fulfillment frameworks. That's what we're talking about here, right? This is just an example of the fulfillment frameworks. We have the 4 pillars of health, and then we have the 6 W's of health, right, and transformation. And then we got like the what, why, how, when, where, who. And then we got the 7 tools of conscious eating. And then we have this entire, food measuring minus metabolism equals the energy plus or minus. All of these are fulfillment frameworks, right? But here's the thing. When we want to talk to somebody who is thinking of joining RWA, do you think that all the fulfillment frameworks is what we talk to them about? No, of course not, because our fulfillment frameworks are kind of like the details. Yeah, we might talk about it a little bit in the marketing here and there, but it's just kind of overwhelming and confusing because they're not in the program yet and we're not actually helping them get the result. So talking to them about the fulfillment frameworks is kind of just overwhelming when we're actually doing marketing to prospects, people who are not actually customers yet, right? And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to have frameworks. This is what we call spice messaging, spice marketing frameworks, is that we have marketing messaging frameworks, which are kind of a little bit more overall. They're a little bit more general about how remote wellness works and exactly why remote wellness is the industry that they should go ahead and join. And so examples of what frameworks like that look like is like the 3 key steps to make a 6-figure income with remote wellness, right? Number 1, avoid spending money to make money. Number 2, focus on transformation, not information. Number 3, focus on client selection and client attraction, right? And then this is another framework that we have specifically when we talk about marketing and our spice messaging and all that kind of stuff, which we went basically ahead and explained, hey, right now, there's a very unique opportunity that is like, hey, there's information overwhelm. People have a lot of information, right? So information has become a commodity. And then people are struggling with doing, right? They struggle with taking action. And then all of a sudden, we're now at a place where remote technology is actually accepted by everyone. And because of these 3 forces, remote wellness is such a perfect career that you could get into right now, right? And so you see here, this framework is a very simple way, kind of like a visual way, a very easy to understand way to understand why remote wellness is so amazing and why they should consider a career in remote wellness, right? And then once they're actually a customer, once they're actually a student, that's when we go ahead and say, okay, cool. Now these are other frameworks that you're going to go ahead and learn in order for you to actually become a remote wellness practitioner and understand how all of that works, okay? And so what you're going to notice here is that our spice messaging frameworks are more around the marketing about why remote wellness is the perfect career, right? And then the fulfillment frameworks are how they actually get the result. And so what you're going to start seeing is that once you actually look through a lot of the swipe files, right? We've talked about swipe files before, the importance of you studying the marketplace. We've really talked about a lot about that in the past already, is that what you're going to notice is that in all of your swipe files, there's always a specific person or specific people that this marketing message is targeting. There's a specific result, a specific outcome that is being promised to these people, right? There's a spice framework, and then there's a unique mechanism. And so an example of this, here's a recent offer that came into my email inbox from 2 gentlemen, Andy Frisella and Ed Milet, right? And you'll see on here that they have their unique mechanism. And if you don't know what a unique mechanism is yet, don't worry, we have all that training for you as well that you will be able to go through if you haven't gone through it already. But their unique mechanism is this thing called Arete, right? So Arete is their unique mechanism. And then if you scroll down on their page, they have scale your business, become a machine, maximize your impact, and unite with a network. That is their messaging framework. That is their spice messaging framework. And then when you actually join their program, I'm sure they probably have a whole bunch of other frameworks that are related to their fulfillment and actually how to get the outcome and the results that they have promised. Okay. And so this is the reason why sometimes we call spice messaging frameworks kind of like our drums, because what it is it's kind of like the big pillars of your messaging that you're going to be drumming over and over and over again in your marketing. So that way people can understand what you are all about, what your unique mechanism is all about, what your company is all about, what your product is all about, what your offer is all about. Okay. And so that's exactly how it works, right? Same thing for us, right? We have our drums that we keep drumming. It's like, hey, right now people are overwhelmed with information. They struggle with doing. There's remote technology, right? That's why remote wellness is so amazing. And so this really was kind of what I wanted wanted to kind of talk about inside of this training was the difference between fulfillment frameworks and spice messaging frameworks. So through all of the other trainings and all of the other sections that we're going to go through in this training, I want you to keep this in mind, is that yes, we're going to talk about the 7 steps for creating your spice framework, but you understand the difference between messaging frameworks and fulfillment frameworks. Those are 2 different things that you want to always make sure that you are keeping in mind, but the same process is still going to be applicable regardless of what framework you are looking to create, okay? Now, the other quick question I want to address here inside of this training is that, can your spice messaging framework be the same as your fulfillment framework? And so the answer to that is yes. In some certain cases, it can actually be the same, right? So for some businesses, what they find is that the framework that they use in their marketing is a lot of times the maybe the same framework that they might use also in their fulfillment, okay? And they can potentially also overlap, right? So that's where a lot of times for beginners, it's confusing to think about marketing, because a lot of times beginners are used to like there being a black or white, yes or no, right or wrong answer. But with marketing, it doesn't work that way. Like marketing doesn't have a clear-cut right or wrong answer. And so there is a lot of fluidity between these concepts of messaging frameworks and fulfillment frameworks. Like it's not like, oh, there's only one thing. Like a fulfillment framework could potentially also be a marketing framework, right? An example of this is Brooke Castillo and her life coach school, right? They do over $40 million a year. And her spice messaging framework is what she calls the model, okay? And the model, they define it as CT-FAR, circumstance creates thought, thought creates feeling, feelings create action, action creates results, right? That's kind of like her model and what she calls of it, right? Now, that also is her spice messaging framework, and then that also is her fulfillment framework, right? And so again, it doesn't necessarily have to be 2 different things. I want to kind of open your mind to think and understand these concepts properly, because I understand that they can sometimes be abstract, right? And so the other thing about this is that in her fulfillment, right, inside of Brooke Castillo's fulfillment, she might also have other frameworks. So just because the model is one of her fulfillment frameworks doesn't mean that she might not have other frameworks inside of her fulfillment as well, right? And then in this case, her spice messaging framework, which is also one of her fulfillment frameworks, also happens to be her unique mechanism. And so it's kind of like this weird land and this weird world where there is a lot of overlap, but all of this just depends on the market, right? And you're going to learn more about this when we talk about unique mechanisms if you haven't already gone through that training, in which what you're really doing is you're looking at the market. In the case of Brooke Castillo, life coaching, everybody and their grandma nowadays has a life coaching certification. So how was she going to stand out? She stands out with her model. And so that model is like, hey, all of these other life coach certifications, the thing that they don't have is the model. And the model happens to also be her fulfillment framework, and it also happens to be her unique mechanism. And so again, I'm going to emphasize this one more time, is that there is a lot of overlap with these concepts, okay? This is not some rigid like black or white, yes or no, right or wrong thing. There is going to be a little bit of abstractness, but over time with repetition, right? We've talked about this many times before, skill equals knowledge times reps. With repetition, you're going to start to get better at identifying kind of the nuance and the details between this, okay? But for right now, all I want you to know is that there can be a difference between spice messaging frameworks and fulfillment frameworks. And so that way you have it in the back of your head when you're creating your frameworks. You can actually think, okay, hey, you know what? How do I want to position my spice messaging framework, my fulfillment frameworks? Do I want them to be the same? Do I want them to be different? All of these are just things that you're exploring, and you're kind of learning about your product, your offer, your messaging, your spice. All of these things contribute to that. So let us know if you have any questions about this. And with that being said, in the next couple trainings, we're going to go ahead and dive into the actual 7-step process. All right, team, welcome to step number 1 of the 7-step process, which is deciding to serve. This is going to be, like I said, the first step of the process, and it is going to be a growth step. So it's going to be all about you really being able to get out of your own way and grow, which again is the number 1 biggest difficulty for newbies, for beginners, people who are just starting out. So there are 2 steps of this process when we talk about step number 1 in deciding to serve. Part number 1 is all about really going out there and deciding knowing that there are people out there who are struggling, that you, yes, you specifically, are capable and willing to actually be able to help them, okay? And this is really challenging when you're really getting started out in the beginning, is because you might be struggling with things like imposter syndrome and all of that stuff. But really, like I said, throughout this entire 7-step framework and throughout this process, you're going to learn to get out of your own way for that. And so you got to decide that, hey, I am going to serve, I am going to make an impact, I do need to find my voice, I am going to find my spice, and it's absolutely going to be worth it for me to become that leader, to become that expert, to become that guide that other people actually need, okay? Now, this is a paragraph, a quote from a book that I really like the way that it was worded on here. Is like, hey, you've been blessed with talents, ideas, unique abilities that have gotten you to where you are in life right now, okay? And these gifts were given to you so that way you could share them with others. This is a belief that you can hold within yourself that, hey, I do have something to contribute into the world. There is a pull that is pulling me to actually serve, to be able to have an impact on other people, right? And so there are people today who need what it is that you have, and they are just waiting for you to actually go out there and find your voice, find your spice, so that way you can help them change their lives. And so it would be an absolute tragedy for them if you actually did not develop your voice right now, if you weren't in the process of developing your voice right now. One of the things that has been so inspirational and motivational for me throughout the years is I always think back to the version of myself from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, right? There were people in my life that, because they had the courage to stand up and, find their voice, to find their spice, that completely altered the trajectory of my life. And so I think in my head, if I could go back and I could just talk to a 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old version of Yasin, right? A 21-year-old version of Yasin, a 25-year-old version of Yasin, a 30-year-old version of Yasin, right? All of those versions of myself had amazing people that influenced me to become a better human being. And so for you to be able to decide that you want to be that for someone else, that is the first step, and the first part of this step is really all about deciding to serve, okay? From there, you then have part number two. Part number two of this entire process is really deciding what you want to become a leader, an expert, or a guide in, right? So the thing is that remote wellness is such a broad industry that there really is space to be able to find your spice in so many different angles and so many different directions and so many different areas of life. So it does not matter what it is, right? So for some practitioners, they really like the health aspect of, remote wellness. They really like those types of frameworks when it comes to health, right? They want to create more frameworks related to health. For some practitioners, they love the mindset piece of it. For some practitioners, they love being able to speak to other people. For some practitioners, they love the relationship aspect of it. They love the, mindset piece of it. They love the connection to something greater piece of it. They love the wealth piece of it, right? Whatever it might be, there is a space for you to be able to decide to create a framework in some area of remote wellness, right? There is somewhere in remote wellness a superpower that is yours, that is hiding for you to go out there and discover and actually put out into the world, okay? And so if this is your first framework, right? If this is your first time creating your spice, then you really want to kind of decide, hey, what is the type of framework that I want to create, right? And usually in the beginning, if this is your first time creating your framework, it's either going to be your core spice messaging framework, or it's going to be one of your core fulfillment frameworks, right? But at the end of the day, you really can use this process for any one of the frameworks, right? So if you want to create a framework on mindset, relationships, connection to something greater, general life, confidence, self-belief, like literally any topic, this exact framework is what you're going to be able to use. But it all starts with being able to decide first that, hey, yes, I want to do this. And number two, I've identified what type of framework I want to actually create, and I want to have that in mind. So that is step number one. Let us know if you have any questions about step number one, and then we're going to go ahead and continue on to the rest of the steps inside of the process. All right, welcome to step number two of the 7-step process. Inside of this step, there are two parts. Part number one is all about learning an insane amount about the topic that you want to become an expert in. And then part number two is actually getting practice sharing it. So let's go and talk about part number one right now, is all about learning an insane amount related to the topic that you want to become an expert in. So in other words, you're going to have to go down the rabbit hole. This was one of our students. We were explaining this concept, and he said, basically what you're saying is you want us to go down the rabbit hole? Yes, exactly. Go down the rabbit hole of the topic that you want to become an expert in, right? You want to become obsessed with the topic. You want to listen to what other people are saying about the topic. You want to live it. You want to breathe it, because the only way that it's really going to spark your imagination around how you can contribute your own framework is going to be by consuming other people's frameworks related to success in that area of life. So we're talking about reading their books, listening to their podcasts, watching their videos, right? Watching them speak at live events. All you want to do is go down the rabbit hole related to the topic that you want to be an expert in, okay? And then part number 2 is that while you are actually learning, right? While you're going through that process of going down the rabbit hole, you need to be sharing, okay? So what you're doing is that not only are you taking your notes, not only are you studying, but you're also sharing out loud, and that's the key word here, you're sharing out loud what it is that you are learning. Now, there's a lot of different mediums that you could do that. Our recommended medium is to just use the Anchor.fm app, the Anchor app, because what that's going to do is going to allow you to be able to have an outlet in order to do so, okay? Now, the reason why this is so important is because when you actually speak out loud what it is that you are learning, it's going to go ahead and force you to start seeing the patterns. And that's exactly what the next step in this process is going to be, because unless you don't see the patterns, you're not going to be able to actually come up with your framework, right? So if you're just learning, but never sharing out loud, then you're not going to get the benefit that you need from this step, okay? So what sharing out loud looks like when you're actually learning is like, hey, I jump on my Anchor app and say, hey, today I was just learning about this. Today I was geeking out about this, right? And this is what I've been learning, right? Or, hey, for those of you who don't know, I'm currently going through my remote wellness certification, and one of the things that I learned today was, right? For those of you who don't know, right now I'm working on putting my framework together, how I'm going to be able to crack helping people with type 2 diabetes, and all of the things that I learned today are right? And so at this stage in the process, you're not trying to position yourself as an expert. All you're doing is you're just the enthusiast. You're just the enthusiastic learner who is sharing exactly what it is that they are learning, right? So all you're doing is you're learning and you're regurgitating so far inside of this process. Also in this step is really the process that as you're so enthusiastic and as you are learning all of these things, you start to be able to plant those seeds for your practice clients, for those people that you're going to be able to test and prove this framework out with. So when people ask you, hey, what have you been up to? How's everything going, right? You can reply, hey, I'm doing my remote wellness certification. Or, hey, I just finished my remote wellness certification. Right now I'm working on putting my frameworks together. Let me talk to you about what I'm learning, right? All you're doing is you're being enthusiastic. You're sharing value. You're giving free information out, right? And then towards the end of that conversation, be like, hey, by the way, I am going to need some practice clients or some test clients later on. So, if you're interested in that, let me know, right? And so all you're doing is you're just sharing, you're getting excited, and it really helps plant those seeds so that way you have those practice clients to prove out your framework with, okay? Now, the other question that we sometimes get about this step is how long does this specific step take? So for most people, the step of being the enthusiastic learner, which is the step that we're talking about right now, for most people, it takes years because they have no one else to share it with, right? They have no other way to actually consolidate their learnings. They're not actually sharing out loud. This is why I said out loud is so important, right? Because when you're doing things out loud while you are learning, it's not going to take you years to be able to come up with your spice. It's not going to take you years to be able to start noticing the patterns, okay? Because if you're actually publishing while you go through this process, it's going to expedite the process of finding your spice from years to just a few weeks or a few months, okay? And so this is why sharing out loud while you're doing this is so important, okay? The other question that happens that comes up when we talk about sharing out loud while you are learning is, hey, doesn't publishing as I'm learning, as I'm becoming the expert, actually make me look weak? Now, here's the thing. Who said that you are the expert right now? You're not, right? Remember, this is only step 2 of the process that you're in right now. You're not trying to posture or position yourself as an expert because you're not, right? You don't want to try and a lot of people say, oh, I'm going to fake it till I make it. No, it's inauthentic to yourself. Your brain knows what you're doing and you're going to have a lot more difficulty. You're going to have a lot more resistance. All you want to do is, hey, you're not the expert right now. You're the enthusiast. That's it. And guess what? If you're publishing on Anchor right now, no one's listening to you. No one. And guess what? That's perfect because you're finding your spice right now. Now, does that mean that you should go back and delete all of those other podcast episodes later on when you become an expert or a guru because of the fact that you don't want to, show that, oh, all of a sudden I was at one point learning? No, because like you learned maybe earlier in this training when we talk about, hey, if I have seen further, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. All those people who want to have an ego around this and act like all of a sudden they were, perfect out of the womb. And those are the people that their audience does not respect. When you actually have those initial podcast episodes that humanizes you, right? It shows, hey, even I was a beginner, right? Even I had nobody who was listening to me. Even I was finding my voice. And so when you are talking to others as a coach, right? As an expert, and you're telling them, hey, even you can be successful. They don't believe in themselves yet. But then when they look back at your journey when you started, then they start to realize, wow, the person that I'm listening to, my leader, my expert, my guide, even they had a part in the process when they were just starting out. So it makes them believe it more and actually makes them love you even more when you have all of those pieces in place. Just to give you an example of even when we were creating this specific framework that you're going through right now, is that we did the exact same process, right? We were learning and sharing, right? So what we did is when we wanted to go ahead and learn, hey, how are we going to help people create their own frameworks? How are we going to help our students create their own spice, right? That was kind of the idea that we had. Number one, we had to go ahead and decide, hey, yes, we want to be the person who can provide this and be the expert of this to our students. That was number one. And then number two is we went out and consumed an insane amount of other people's frameworks related to helping people find their spice and helping people find their frameworks, okay? And then what we did is we shared them out loud, right? We did it internally, right? Because at this point, we're at the stage where we don't necessarily have to create it out loud publicly, but for you as a beginner, that publicly is going to be extremely, extremely important. But what we did is we shared it out loud, right? We processed it for us to be able to really start to find the patterns, which is the next step that we're going to talk about, okay? Other examples of this is that if you want to create a framework on helping other people overcome type 2 diabetes, well, the question is, what are all of the other people's frameworks that they have in terms of helping people with type 2 diabetes, right? Have you consumed those frameworks yet, right? If your goal is to help independent mothers love themselves and get healthy again and feel like they're in their 20s, well, the question is, what are all of the other people's frameworks that help independent mothers do that? And have you consumed them? Have you studied them, right? Are they in your swipe file? Are you looking at other people's processes, right? That's what we're talking about when you're learning it. And then on top of that, you have to make sure that you are sharing it out loud so that way you can eventually start to see the patterns that are going on there as well. And so that's why when we talk about step number 2 of this entire process, there are 2 parts. Remember, learn an insane amount about the topic that you want to become an expert in. And then number 2, you got to get practice sharing it. So that is step number 2. Let us know if you have any questions with that specific step, and then we're going to go ahead and continue on into the rest of the 7 steps as well. All right, team, let's keep this party rocking and rolling. So step number 3 is finding patterns from multiple sources. Okay, so we are on step number 3, which is all about finding pattern. And this is really where an interesting transition starts to happen, because as you're constantly going down the rabbit holes and learning from other people's frameworks, what's going to happen is that as you're sharing out loud, right, in your publishing, you're continuously sharing out loud, what's going to happen is that you're going to start to see trends and patterns in what it is that not only are you learning, but also in what it is that you are teaching, okay? And so this is why it's so important to make sure that you are constantly publishing on a daily, consistent basis, because you're going to go ahead and have light bulbs start going off in your brain as you start to connect different ideas from different people. So here's an example of what that might actually look like. So, you know, in your publishing, you're going, hey, so today I was learning about how Tony Robbins, talks about identity shifting, and he was saying da 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 da, and then you have this light bulb go off, and you're like, you know what? That's actually very similar to another concept that I've learned from, Remote Wellness Academy, and Coach Yassine talks about the becoming process, and what Remote Wellness Academy says is da 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 da, right? But what I'm starting to realize is that I would like to call it da 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 something else instead. And so naturally what's happening is that your epiphanies are leading to you starting to kind of have your own voice within these frameworks. And so as you're going through those books and listening to the podcasts and watching the videos and listening to the topics, right, you're starting to notice that different people are talking about the same concepts, and all they're doing is they're using different terms. It is at that point that you have started to identify the patterns, right? When you start to identify these patterns is when you know that you are on the right track of actually starting to be able to create your own framework. But again, remember, this only happens when you're actually getting multiple different points of views from multiple different opposing opinions, right? When, hey, Tony Robbins says this, and then RWA says this, and there's a little bit of a contradiction there, and then you start to talk about it, and you're like, oh, I can see how how, what Tony's talking about is this, and then what Coach Yassine is talking about is this, right? And so your goal is to really consume so much of other people's frameworks that you start to see that pattern that allows you to then start to be able to create your own opinion, which is what's going to happen next when you start to create your framework hypothesis, right? And all of that's going to start to come together. And this is very different than what most people do. What most people actually learn, they only learn from one topic, from one person, or from one source, right? And that's what causes them to be unable to actually create their own frameworks because they can't really see how the same topic could be discussed from a different point of view, from a different angle, right? But it's only when you start to consume different points of views can you actually start to think, okay, hey, this same topic can actually be explained in a different way, right? It's like, hey, I heard Coach Yassine, Tony Robbins, Healthy Gamer, and Mel Robbins say da-da-da-da-da, but I like to put my own spin on it, and that would be da-da-da-da-da, right? And so the big thing that you have to understand is that as soon as you start doing this, that is when you'll be able to start creating your own frameworks, which is the next step, right? And so you just have to remember that every new idea is really just a mashup or a remix of one or more previous ideas. Okay, that's all you have to remember, and that's how you're going to be able to start creating your own framework. And really how this works, like I said, I'm not going to kind of beat the dead horse here, but I just want to kind of make this very, very kind of specific for you, is that you want to find 2 to 3 other sources that are kind of in the same, industry, talking about the same topics, helping similar kinds of people, and you want to consume those frameworks. Now, in your head, if you only consume from one person, you're going to think, oh, you know what? This is the only way that it could be taught. Or, hey, you know what? This is the only way that it could be explained. And it's just so unique the way that Coach Yassine talks about the becoming process, right? But that's just not true, right? Nothing is original, right? We've already talked about this. Every new idea is just a mashup or a remix of other previous ideas with just a little bit of a spin to it. A typical example of this is kind of like in certification when you learned about conscious eating, right? Conscious eating is just our spin and our own framework out of the patterns that we saw when people were actually talking about mindful eating, intuitive eating, right? There's so many people that talk about those specific things, right? And so what we did is we decided that we wanted to create a framework on conscious eating, intuitive eating, mindful eating, whatever that might be, right? We didn't know it was going to be called conscious eating. And then what we did is we learned and we shared, and then we started seeing those patterns. And then in the next step, you're going to learn how we started creating a framework hypothesis around this, right? Now, if you only learned conscious eating from Remote Wellness Academy, you would think, damn, these guys are geniuses. How do they come up with this? But the reason is because we just took the patterns that we were seeing and then we started putting our own twist to those things. And so they're all the same concept, right? Mindful eating, intuitive eating, they're all the same concept, right? But it's a tweak that we've gone ahead and put it, right? And so that's kind of our spice, right? But what you want to do is you want to consume other people's frameworks, and then you're going to start to see, oh, they're all really just talking about the same thing. And then at that point, you start to have your own thoughts, and then that way you can create your own framework, which is a combination of different people's frameworks, rather than you feeling like you're copying one specific person because your source is only one specific person. Now, there are a couple of reasons why this is also important, right? Number one, it helps you learn better. Number two, you're not going to feel like you're copying one specific person because you're pulling from multiple different sources. And on top of that, the reason why anyone else is going to pay you or work with you, or you realize that you're unique or really have a light bulb moment that goes off, is because you've actually taken the time to study other points of view. Is because of the fact that you've actually taken the time to be able to understand the patterns, and you've saved the prospect, the consumer, that you saved the customer, the client, the time of having to go out there and find the patterns themselves. You've already gone ahead and found those patterns for them. And that's why it's so valuable. Okay. Now, an example of this would be, for example, like the becoming process, right? Remote Wellness Academy, Remote Wellness, right? Coach Yassine, we have this becoming process. Now, the becoming process, you look at it and you're like, dang, that's, unique. It's different. It's compiled in a way that's really simple. But then when you start to learn about this and you start asking yourself, hey, how does Tony Robbins talk about this? How does James Clear talk about this? How does Joe Dispenza, Maxwell Maltz, Mel Robbins, Dr. Nicole LePera, right? How do they talk about this concept of identity shifting, right? What are other traditional sources, like maybe the Quran, the Bible, the Torah, right? How are they talking about the concept of identity, right? And what you're doing is you're starting to see the patterns underneath, right? Even though they might be using different terms. Yes, of course, all these people and all these books and all these references are not going to be using the becoming process specifically, but what are they talking about when it comes to the concept underneath the term, right? And you're going to start to notice, oh, there's all these different patterns, right? Coach Yassine talks about becoming process, right? Tony Robbins talks about identity shifting. James Clear talks about XYZ. This person talks about XYZ. And then when you start to see all these patterns from different points of view, that is when you're ready to go ahead and get to the next step, which is allows you to be able to create your own framework hypothesis. And so once you start to consume enough points of view about, let's say, mindset or personal development, you're going to be able to see, hey, they're all talking about in their own way, with their own terms, with their own spice, this topic of the becoming process. And so then what you do is you prime your reticular activating system, right? The part of your brain that just sees patterns everywhere, right? Once your brain is primed to start seeing those concepts that look similar to the becoming process, then all of a sudden you're getting different points of view and you start to see the becoming process everywhere. And so yes, we do license our frameworks to you, but the question that you want to ask yourself is that, yes, hey, by all means, go ahead and use the becoming process the way we talk about the becoming process, right? But the question is, how would you explain it differently, right? How would you explain your frameworks to your clients, right? And so like we talked about earlier, it might be a fulfillment framework. And obviously you can use our fulfillment frameworks. We've licensed them to you. You are an RWA student. But at the same time, if you want to utilize some of these things in your marketing, you want to start to think and identify how you would talk about them differently, right? You don't only want to rely for the rest of your career on our frameworks, right? You want to follow this 7-step process to be able to create your own frameworks as well, okay? And the reason why this is so important is because the better you become at creating and teaching your own frameworks, the more successful you will become. And the reason for that is because this skill of being able to take extremely complex, abstract concepts, right, and then be able to create a framework around it, especially if you can create a visual around it, is such a high in-demand skill that you will be very good, whether that be in a leadership perspective of leading your team because you can talk to other people, whether that be as a parent, whether that be as a coach, whether that be as a business owner, in every aspect of life. This skill is going to serve you dividends over and over and over and over again, okay? Now, another quick question I want to talk about in terms of how long does it take to be able to find those patterns. Again, for most people, if they're not publishing, if they're not talking out loud, right, if they're doing everything and learning everything hypothetically and theoretically, then for them, it's going to take them a very long time because they're trying to keep count of all of those notes that they're learning inside of their head. Versus if you're speaking it out loud, right, and you're actually talking about what it is that you're learning, you're going to expedite the process of you being able to find those patterns because it's something that what we call externally processing. When you're externally processing, it's kind of like you're thinking out loud. It's like kind of like you're processing, but instead of trying to process in your head and then kind of keep it internal and kind of like, making it all theoretical and hypothetical in your head where it kind of just loops, when you externally process and talk about it out loud, what's happening is that you're expediting that process of you having those epiphany breakthroughs to be able to start seeing those patterns. I'm telling you, every single time that I have ever tried to create a framework in my own head without actually publishing, without actually externally processing, without actually sharing it out loud, I have never been successful because it gets all jumbled in my head and then I get all confused. I'm like, what's the breakthrough? What's the breakthrough? What's the breakthrough? And then every single time I externally process it, every single time I talk about it out loud, every single time I teach what it is that I am learning, right? So like I'm learning from these different sources, right? And I start to teach, hey, this is what Tony Robbins says. Hey, this is what Dr. Nicole LaPera says. Hey, this is what, Russell Brunson says. Hey, you know what? This is what James Clear says. I try to teach it to someone else, right? Usually in the form of a podcast, or I'll teach it to my wife, or I'll teach it to my business partner, or I'll teach it to some of the other coaches, right? I'll externally process this, and then every single time, that's when I get that breakthrough. And so this is the reason why the first steps of this entire process right here are green, like we talked about in a previous training, is because this is the growth phase in which you're really going out there and consuming as much as you can and publishing and sharing, because you're being that enthusiastic learner who shares and talks about things out loud. So that way you're learning about the patterns and you're sharing those patterns that you are finding, right? And so when you do that, like I said, you will expedite that process of having that breakthrough. Instead of it taking it years for you to happen, it will only take a few weeks and a few months. And so that's why sharing out loud what it is that you are learning is so absolutely important. And so that is is the third step when we talk about the 7-step process of creating your SPICE framework. It's about finding patterns from multiple sources. So again, let us know if you have any questions about this specific step, and it's so absolutely critical to make sure that you understand. And so with that being said, we'll go ahead and continue on the 7-step process from there. All right, team, let's keep this train going. Step number 4, which is about creating your framework hypothesis. And so what's going to happen now is that as you've been going through this process of being the enthusiastic learner, you're going through that growth phase of the framework, it's now finally time to actually go into the lab and put together your framework hypothesis, right? Except the thing is that the very important process of this is that if you do all of the steps in order, up until now inside of this process, it's not like you're going to have to go into a lab and come out with some magical moment. And the reason why is because if you've actually been the enthusiastic learner who shares all of the things that you've been learning throughout step 1, 2, and 3, then this step of actually creating your framework hypothesis actually is already aching to come outside of you, right? It will absolutely be effortless because you're going to be oozing with so many ideas on how you actually want to improve and make different all of the other frameworks that you've been consuming and finding patterns of from the previous steps. But again, it's only going to be effortless if you've actually been learning and sharing and externally processing other people's patterns and other people's frameworks that you have been learning. Okay, so how do you know when you are actually ready to go out there and create your own framework hypothesis? Again, it's going to be something that it's going to want to go basically come out of you, right? Because you're having so many insights and ideas about how you would do things different and better, or the way that you would do it instead, right? And so at that point, when you get to that point, you're like, dude, I've consumed so much about this topic, so many frameworks, and I'm at the point now where I understand this and I want to go ahead and kind of create my own framework. That's when you know you're ready to go ahead and create your own framework hypothesis. It's not going to be something that's very hard for you to come up with on your own because you have so many different ideas about it. And so the first step of this process is to really identify what type of framework are you creating, right? Are you going to be creating a SPICE messaging framework or a fulfillment framework, right? We've talked about this in the past in a previous training, but I want to go ahead and highlight this again because it is very important to understand what type of hypothesis you're making, because SPICE messaging frameworks are typically a lot easier to come up with than fulfillment frameworks, right? Now, we've talked about how we've already licensed to you our fulfillment framework, so it's not like you got to go out there and try and reinvent the wheel here, right? But I just want you to be aware of, hey, you're probably only going to have a handful, probably 1, 2, maybe 4 or 5, SPICE messaging frameworks, and you're probably going to have a lot more fulfillment frameworks. But again, remember, it's not like these are like clear cut where there's a line in between here. Sometimes in some cases you might also use your fulfillment frameworks as your messaging, but there is a little bit of a delineation between the two and a separation between the two as well, okay? Now, in regards to actually coming up with your SPICE messaging framework hypothesis, right? Let me go ahead and talk to you about that very quickly here. Sometimes these are known as your messaging drums or your messaging buckets. And the reason why is because these are kind of like the messaging drums that you beat over and over again to make noise in the marketplace. And so the reason why they're called your messaging buckets is because they're kind of like the containers that encompass all of the different messaging that you might have. A lot of times it is going to be typically around 3 messaging drums. It is possible sometimes to also have 4, right? So like in our marketing VSL, our 3 drums were information overwhelm, people are struggling with doing, and then remote technology. Like those are the 3 drums that we hit over and over again as to why remote wellness was such a perfect opportunity. And then we had another similar framework later on inside of our marketing where we talked about the 3 keys. And this was a little bit of a fulfillment framework, but we used it for messaging in terms of the 3 keys to making a 6-figure income with remote wellness, right? Another example that we talked about was the offer that came into my email with Andy Frisella and Ed Milet, right? They had buckets of messaging for them that was, hey, scale your business, become a machine, maximize your impact, and unite with a network, right? Those were their 4 messaging buckets. And this was, as a whole, their messaging framework, right? That's what we're talking about when we talk about SPICE messaging frameworks. And then the other type of creating fulfillment frameworks is a little bit more intense. I'm going to go ahead and walk you through the step-by-step of this, right? So step one of this is kind of deciding what is the outcome that you want to have. So as an example, maybe you want to create a fulfillment framework for, getting your license, your driver's license, or maybe for us for this training, we wanted to create a framework of how to create frameworks, right? So it's a framework to make frameworks. And so that's step number one. Then step number two is to go ahead and brainstorm all of the steps that would be involved with actually making that framework. Now, I'm not going to go through and read this step by step. It is going to be in the guide underneath this training, but I'm going to walk you through this, right? When you brainstorm this, it might be something in regards to like this, what we have, how to create your own framework, right? So it's like, okay, learn from a bunch of people, create your framework, experiment on yourself, work with others for free to prove your framework, believe in yourself, have confidence that you can do it, speak and share out loud what you're thinking, externally process. Like, we're just dumping a bunch of things in regards to how somebody would actually get the result using that framework. And then from there, step number three, you're going to go ahead and just order the steps and the sub-steps. Again, I'm not going to go through this, step by step on here, but you can find it in the guide. So we do have an example for you on there, like getting your driver's license, how to create your own framework. So what we did is we basically take that dump from the previous step. And now what we do is we just go ahead and order them. We say, okay, you know what? Step one is this, step two is this, step three is this, step four is this, step five is this, step six is this, step seven is this, right? And so naturally, there's kind of like a rhythm or a pattern that's emerging from your own frameworks, right? And then from there, step number four, expand on the steps that you have. We go ahead and I usually do this in a Google document. It's kind of like an entire document on you expanding on every single one of those steps. And then step number five is for you to go ahead and name it something proprietary, right? Proprietary means like it's something that is your own intellectual property. A lot of times we use terms like, the process, the formula, the number step system, the blueprint, the method, the pattern, the strategy, the intensive, the incubator, the big three, right? Something cycle, right? And so this is going to change over time. And the reason why we call it a hypothesis is because even the name and even the steps and everything's going to kind of adjust as you go along. So we had our how to create your own framework, right? And initially we called this like the 7-step SPICE. And then we said, you know what, let's talk about it like the 7-step SPICE process, and then the 7-step SPICE discovery process, and the 7-step SPICE creation process, right? We're just kind of messing around with it. In the exact same way, we have different examples about the becoming process, the results formula, the wheel of wellness, the step cycle, the skills curve, right? And so what you can do is you can just go ahead and kind of name it something that sounds like a container, something that sounds a little bit catchy. And then step number 6, creating a visual for it. It's optional, but highly recommended. Again, this is going to be a hypothesis that evolves. You can see on here, when we first wanted to create this exact framework that you're going through for these trainings, this is what it kind of started off with. I went on Canva, looked for images that kind of looked similar to what I wanted it to be. Then I kind of thought about how I wanted to order them, right? And then after that, we kind of came up with like, okay, maybe we can make it steps, and I got to mess around with the colors and all of that kind of stuff. And then finally, the 7th step of this is to remember that this is just a hypothesis. We are in just a second actually going to prove this hypothesis out as a framework, so that way you can actually have a proven framework that you are an expert of. Real quick, let me just go ahead and show you a bunch of different frameworks that obviously we've come up with, and a lot of these we do use for fulfillment, that a lot of these are licensed to you to be able to use for your fulfillment. But again, remember, you can use these for marketing messages as well, and then you want to come up with your own for your marketing message as well, right? So obviously the 7-step SPICE creation process, that is an example of a framework. Big 4 pillars of health, blood sugar roller coaster, right? That equation, becoming process, all of these are just different examples of frameworks that we have come up with on the fulfillment side in order to actually explain the topic that we're actually going ahead and talking about. Again, remember, you don't have to stress out about this either, right? I know sometimes it looks a little bit intimidating and scary to create, but you are going to get better and better and better at it. The more reps that you do, the better that you get at creating and teaching your own frameworks, the more successful you will ultimately become. And ultimately, it is going to be effortless for you to be able to do this step if you've actually properly done these steps as well. Another couple quick points around this as we kind of close out this section and this step of the training is to understand that also you can have frameworks within frameworks. So you might have like one core framework, right? Like in certification, we used to have like phase 1 and then phase 2. And then what we realized was like phase 1 and phase 2 didn't make sense because there was technically like 3 phases. And then we jumped and we started making like, step 1, step 2, step 3. And then we had like sub frameworks underneath that. And so we've been messing around with this on the certification side for a long time. And this is the reason why we call it a hypothesis, because ultimately it is is going to change. It's just a matter of getting something on paper and then slowly starting to prove it out and really start to be able to kind of get an idea of what it looks like. And this is the reason why we call it the iteration cycle. You are going to have kind of like a hypothesis, and then the hypothesis is going to go ahead and combine with the real world data that you're collecting as you put it out there. And then the combination of the hypothesis and the real world data is going to go ahead and create the next version of what it is that you're putting together, right? And so that cycle just repeats, right? Then that becomes version 2. Version 2 then meets real world data again, and then it becomes version 3, right? So that's supposed to say version 3 on there. And then obviously you can see even this hypothesis, right? We got to tweak it and make it even better, right? And then version 3 goes out there and, combines with the real world, becomes version 4. Version 4 combines with real world data and then becomes version 5. So it's all about having something on paper, right? Starting with some sort of hypothesis and then going out there and then really being able to combine it with real world data in order for it to evolve and become more of your next version. Okay, so this is how pretty much anything is born. And so you just want to get started on creating some sort of framework hypothesis. Don't get stuck in saying, oh, I have my hypothesis and that's it. You really want to go out there and really continue that iteration cycle. And this is exactly the same way the becoming process actually works as well. You have your version 1, and then you go out there and have the real world, and then the real world informs you, hey, this is what it actually has to be. And then you have your version 2 from there. And then finally, for this section over here, a common question we get is, can I use my fulfillment frameworks for spice messaging? As we've talked about this in previous trainings, absolutely yes. You're going to start to notice that there's no clear-cut 100% answer for this. However, there are some frameworks that you can in fact use from your fulfillment frameworks to use them as your spice messaging frameworks. An example of this would be like, hey, in our VSL, we only really have like, let's say 15 minutes to explain what remote wellness is. Well, that's not enough time for us to be able to go into other frameworks that might be our fulfillment frameworks, right? And so we're going to stick to our typical kind of 3 drums spice messaging framework. But when we do like live trainings and live coaching and weekly live streams, we have much more of an open format where we have, let's say, 30 to 45 minutes every single week. And so not only are we going to be able to use not only our spice messaging frameworks, but also many of our fulfillment frameworks in order to actually provide value as well. So the big thing you want to remember here is that don't be afraid to really give away everything for free when you're providing value, right? Because here's the thing, people are going to not only love you more, but the reason why people pay you, let's say $1,200, $2,400, $3,600, $5,800, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000, whatever your primary offer price is, the reason why people pay you that amount is because of the results and the value that they received ahead of time. So let's say, for example, you're trying to go ahead and sell your program for $3,600. Well, your aim needs to be that in your marketing, in your value, in your, let's say, YouTube videos, your live coaching XYZ, that you give away $3,600 in value here. And then that way they give you money in exchange for the previous value that they received. And then your program and the goal of your program is now to go ahead and deliver value that is going to be in excess, so that way they will stay with you for, let's say, the next program. And so that's kind of how it works, right? And so a quote that I really love in order to remember this is that give away information, sell implementation, okay? And so you shouldn't be afraid, even if that means you're not giving away, remember, you're not giving away like worksheets and step-by-step and one-on-one coaching and all that kind of stuff, right? What you're doing in marketing is that it's a one-to-many format, right? You're not, let's say, taking on one-on-one clients. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying take on free one-on-one clients. No, what we're saying is that in those one-to-many formats, right? Whether that be podcasting, YouTube, live stream, your community, like all of these formats, you're giving away as much of the value that you can give because of the fact that you know that inside of a live coaching call, in a podcast, in a YouTube video, whatever that might be, right? Whatever form or medium of publishing that's happening, right? A VSL, an ad, you cannot cater and customize and help the person implement what it is that is happening because it's just a, recorded format. It's something that is, one to many. And so the reason why somebody joins your program is to be able to get that nuance, that detail, that customization, that implementation, that accountability, that support, all of the frameworks being put together for them, right? In a cohesive curriculum. All of that is the reason why they join your program, right? They're not joining your program for the purposes of information. And so do not be afraid to give away that information in some of these longer formats, whether that be you want to share your fulfillment frameworks, whether that be you want to share your spice messaging frameworks. Like share all of the frameworks, no problem, right? But then all of the worksheets, the implementation, the customization, all of that is inside of your programs. And so the biggest thing is don't be afraid to give away free value, like genuine, honest, free value, because when you are able to do that, then people are going to go ahead and you're showing results ahead of time, you're showing value ahead of time. That is when people are actually going to want to work with you even more. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, I know is a little bit of a longer one, but that is step number 4 of the entire 7-step process of really creating your framework. And what we're talking about here is creating your framework hypothesis. And so if you have any specific questions about this, let us know. I know sometimes this topic can get a little bit abstract. It is a little bit kind of no right or wrong, left or right kind of thing. And so you might need some help with this. You might have some questions. So do, in fact, let us know if you have any questions. All right, gang, welcome to step number 5, which is testing your framework on yourself. And so at this point in the entire process, you have a basic outline of your framework, and you've named your framework, and you have a hypothesis of what your framework is really going to be, right? But like we talked about in the previous step, this is just a hypothesis, right? So now what needs to happen is that your framework needs to be tested to see if it actually works. Now remember, you're typically going to test fulfillment frameworks, spice messaging frameworks. Yes, there is a little bit of testing that goes along with that as well, kind of, testing it on yourself, seeing if it actually worked for you, kind of talking about it, externally processing. But spice messaging frameworks, your 3 buckets, your 3 drums, there's not as much, quote unquote, testing that happens, but absolutely when we talk about fulfillment frameworks, there is much more testing that is involved there. So that way you can prove out that your framework actually works from a fulfillment standpoint. So remember, you are expecting to be the leader and the expert, right? That's the goal that you're trying to get to. And so that does mean that as you follow this process, it is going to be important for you to actually go out there and test it yourself, because you can't claim to be an expert as something that you yourself have not actually tested. So a couple reasons why this is important. Number 1, it does help you find the holes, because remember, it's just a hypothesis. I cannot tell you how many times we've created a hypothesis, even though we went through all those growth steps ahead of time, right? And then we end up tweaking it and tweaking it and tweaking it and coming up with something that is even better, right? Number 2 is the devil is in the details, right? Even though you might think you know the process, but when you actually test it on yourself, you realize, oh, dang, I forgot this, right? And then number 3 is conviction. So that way you actually have certainty that the framework that you are going to be in fact selling is going to be something that works for the person because of the fact that you did it yourself, right? And this is test number 1, because obviously we're going to go ahead and prove this with others as well, right? And then the other question is, hey, but what if I can't actually test the framework on myself, right? Like some students, they want to help people, let's say, cure type 2 diabetes, but they don't have type 2 diabetes right now, right? So how can you actually test something like that? And the answer to that is by using markers to see if they actually improve. So for example, people who have diabetes actually test their insulin sensitivity, blood sugar levels using something called HbA1c or an A1C test, right? And there's other glucose monitors and insulin tests that you can do as well. So even though you might not have type 2 diabetes, if your framework is to help people just lose weight or eat less sugar or walk, right? Just examples, then what you can do is you can actually do the things that are in your framework. And there's many people who don't even have diabetes, but actually test their A1C levels, because the A1C level has many other health benefits to actually track as well, right? And so this is just an example of how you can actually test the framework on yourself, even if you necessarily don't have that specific case. And so again, this is just an example, right? You can get creative around this, but the reason why this is important is because when you do the actions that you are going to be telling your clients to do, even if you don't have the same problem that they have, it is going to allow you to be able to understand their situation so much better, right? And this is the reason why the celebrity trainer, I don't know if you remember this a while back, it kind of got famous and kind of went a little bit viral, where there was a gentleman, I don't remember his exact name, I think it was Drew Manning. Yep, Drew Manning was his name. And he actually came up with this thing called fit to fat to fit, right? And so he purposely actually got fat in order to actually learn and see if his framework actually works. So he did the dang work to be able to prove it for himself. And then guess what? He never had to worry about money ever again. Now, I'm not saying you should go out there and like get diabetes or like, do something crazy in order to actually prove this self. Now, if you did that, it would probably work and you'd probably never have to worry about money again, because people are be like, dang, that's a crazy story. But that's not the point, right? The point is that you got to prove the framework out on yourself in some way, shape, or form, even if it is in a small way. Because what Drew said, I remember watching an interview with him, is he said that even though I had frameworks to help people lose weight for so long, I myself had never gone through that transformation. And so I myself, when I actually got fat, I learned so much, and it allowed me to be able to really understand the situation of the people that I was helping. And so for him, in the grand scheme of things, in the biggest time horizon possible, it was like he was taking one step back to be able to take 1,000 steps forward, right? And it was absolutely worth it for him every single time, right? And so this is the mindset that you really want to have, especially if you're not trying to be like a snake oil salesman who has like a dry run, a quick flash in the pan, a quick run, and then that's it, because you have a poor reputation because your framework actually doesn't work, right? And especially this is important when we talk about fulfillment frameworks, right? But of course, as we've already learned, spice messaging frameworks and messaging frameworks kind of seep into fulfillment frameworks. There is a lot of overlap there. And so even in your spice messaging frameworks, you can't all of a sudden say, hey, these are the 3 steps for you to be able to succeed and not have diabetes anymore. And it's not really based on anything. And so that's the reason why it's so important to make sure that you have a foundation of which you are actually going ahead and setting up all of your frameworks on, right? And so this really is what we call test number 1. Okay, this is test number 1 because like we talked about, you go ahead and you have the hypothesis, right? You test the hypothesis with real world data, right? The two combine, and that goes ahead and creates your next version, okay? And so what's happening is that you're having this entire wave of tests that you're doing, right? You're testing it on yourself, and then in the next step, you're going to prove it with others as well. And it's this process that really refines your framework so that way it becomes better and better and better. And guess what? Just like most things in life, the first time you do this, you're going to suck. And so skill equals knowledge times reps. And the more reps that you do, the more reps that you do, the more reps that you do, your framework is only going to become better and better and better. Okay. And so that is step number 5 of the entire process, which is testing the framework on yourself. If you do have any questions about this, maybe the nuance around this, if you're like, you know what, how do I maybe test this framework on myself? Maybe it's the difference between a spice messaging framework or a fulfillment framework. Let us know if you have any questions about this specific step in the process. And with that being said, we're going to catch you on the next training. All right, the party continues with step number 6, prove the framework out with others. This is the 6th step in the SPICE framework creation process. And this is what we really call test number 2, right? So we've talked about the iteration cycle and how you basically take this hypothesis and now you need to expose it to the real world, right? So the real world we've exposed it to already is testing it on yourself, but now it's about exposing it to the real world with testing it with other people in order to really go ahead and refine it and come up with your next version. So let's go ahead and talk about proving your framework out with others. How do you do this? So ideally what you're going to do now is you're going to go ahead and take your framework, right? If it is a, let's say, fulfillment framework, it is, let's say, a spice messaging framework. And what you're going to do is you're going to walk 1 to 2 dream clients through the entire framework, typically for free or charity or, all the other different strategies that you've learned in certification, right? Because of the fact that just because the framework worked for you, the question is it going to work for other people, right? Maybe it worked for you, but maybe it doesn't work for other people the way that you think it's going to work for other people. And so this is really where you start to now actually prove that you can provide value by being able to do it for free. Because at the end of the day, why would somebody pay a prolific expert if their spice doesn't actually do anything, right? And so by doing the dang work, you become someone who has their own unique spice. And so this is really where most people don't want to do this step because they want to be the snake oil salesman who's a quick flash in the pan, hey, I'm going to put up a website or a logo and say, hey, I'm the best in the world at this and you should just pay me. When in fact, what you actually want to make sure that you do is you're proving out your frameworks, especially if they're fulfillment frameworks, to make sure that they actually work. Right now, do you actually have to do this and work for free in order to do this? Well, here's the thing. If this is your first main framework, if this is especially like a fulfillment framework, you want to make sure that you are actually talking to others, getting other people's feedback, walking them through the process, right? So that way you have that absolute certainty and conviction that it is in fact going to work. And the reason why this is important is because the very next step of this entire process is to actually become the prolific expert, right? You're actually going to go ahead and start to talking to the masses about this framework. And so you really want to make sure that you are stress testing it, you are proving it out, so that way it actually works properly. Because at the end of the day, the frame that you want to approach this with, right, when you go to your practice clients is, hey, if I'm able to go ahead and help you with this framework, right, then I'm actually going to be charging a lot of money for this. But right now, what I want to do is I want to help you, no strings attached, right? Genuinely just want to help you, right? And then I want to help you for free or for charity or some of the other strategies that we've talked about. And I'm actually going to be charging a lot more for this in the future. So this is step number 6 of proving your framework out with others. Now, of course, like we've talked about, there's many different frameworks that you are going to be creating. Does that mean that you have to walk somebody for free through all of those frameworks? No, right? It's just a matter of understanding, understanding, hey, if this is my core framework, yes, but then all of the smaller frameworks that you're using to just explain concepts, that's a little bit of a different story where you don't necessarily have to walk somebody through, but definitely getting input from somebody else is going to be very important, so that way you can prove it out and then get that external processing happening with other people, and then you're absolutely sharing this as well throughout this process. But remember, you are always going to be tweaking your framework, so every single time you talk about it, teach it to somebody else, talk to somebody else about it, walk somebody else through it, you're always going to be tweaking it. And just like everything else in life, skill equals knowledge times reps. And so being able to deliver your framework, teach your framework, prove out your framework is absolutely a skill. And the longer you stick with it, the better you're going to be able to chip away at it and make tweaks to it as well. Okay, so that is step number 6, which is proving your framework out with others. If you do have any questions about this specific step, do make sure that you go ahead and let us know so we can help you through this, so that way you can get to the point where you are that expert, that prolific expert of your proven framework and getting through the iteration cycles properly. All right, step number 7, becoming the prolific expert of your proven framework. So at this point, you've tested your framework, right? You've proven that your framework actually works. And what that means is that you've actually earned the right to be the expert of your framework because of the fact that it's now proven, right? Now, does that mean that your framework is perfect? No. Honestly, I have frameworks that I'm still tweaking on a regular basis. We have frameworks that we're always tweaking, and every single time we go through them, we're always making them better and better and better, right? Now, does that mean that the name of your framework is going to change? Hey, maybe the name stays the same. Maybe you decide to tweak it, right? The point being is that the explanations and everything is going to be kind of like a work of art that you're always trying to go ahead and perfect, and you're always going ahead and making tweaks to them more and more and more, right? But the big point on here is that when you get to this point, that's when you are able to go ahead and be the expert of your framework. Now, a common question we get is, hey, but what if others know more about the topic than I do? Well, here's the thing. Spice is not about knowledge, right? Spice is about your unique flavor, personality, energy, and vibe, right? And so nobody can know more about your spice than you. And the reason for that is because, hey, you created the framework, right? And so if you definitely followed the steps, right? You were out there, you decided to serve, you learned and shared, you found patterns, you made your framework hypothesis, you tested it on yourself, you proved it, then at that point, it is a framework that is unique to you, that nobody else can be the expert of that, right? Because nobody else has a framework that is like yours. It is absolutely your spice that is made up of your experiences about life, your background, your psychographics, your demographics, right? It's all about being authentic to you. Even if somebody was to try and say exactly what it is that you say, nobody's going to attract the same demographics as you. Like, for example, a lot of the face that we have for Remote Wellness Academy at the time of recording this training is we're primarily male dominant, right? Because a lot of the psychographics and demographics, the ads and kind of the publishing that we do is 2 guys talking about it, right? Now, if we wanted to go ahead and have, let's say, for example, a female face to the company, then we would attract more females, right? Now, that's just how it is that, hey, depending on maybe, your ethnicity, maybe your kind of background, maybe the way that you talk, you are automatically going to attract people who are more like you, right? Your aesthetic is going to attract a certain type of people, right? And so that's just one example of when it comes down to gender, right? Just in terms of how you speak, your background, all of these things are naturally going to attract certain types of people to you. And so you never have to try to worry about competition or like, hey, is somebody else going to purchase from somebody else or all of this kind of stuff. It's just a bunch of noise, because at the end of the day, the marketplace and the pie is so much bigger than you can ever imagine. And you are going to get your seat at the table. You are going to earn your slice of the pie as long as you are being authentic, as long as you are doing the work to earn your frameworks. As long as you're doing that, the people in the marketplace who resonate with you and your messaging will come to you, and the people who don't resonate with you and your messaging will not come to you. They'll find somebody else who's maybe in the same space, but they resonate with more. And that's a good thing because of the fact that you want your spice to actually stand for something. Because if you don't stand for anything, then you'll fall for everything, right? So it doesn't matter if others might know more about the topic, because nobody is going to be able to know more about your proven framework, your authenticity, your voice, your spice more than you are, because nobody can compete with being a better version of you, because guess what? There's only you that is available. There's only you that actually exists, right? And so at the end of the day, the time has come really, once you get to step number 7, for you to really go out there and lead, right? Because you now have one of the key ingredients of your spice messaging, and you're now able to go ahead and lead a community, right? When you start to get that unique mechanism in place, you find your people, you find their specific result, that's when you are able to go out there and really coach and launch your community. Okay, now a couple points in terms of being that prolific expert, being that prolific leader. Number 1, you want to make sure that you are always publishing constantly. This is such an important topic that we're probably going to make a separate training for this to talk to you about, hey, testing your material, sharing your insights, documenting the journey, right? Number 2, you want to learn to be prolific. As long as you're consistently publishing and you're coming up with new insights, you're working with clients, working with customers, working with prospects, you're never going to end up falling into that vanilla mainstream because you're always coming up with new ideas and new insights. But as soon as you start to become complacent, that is when you start to not become that prolific expert, okay? Number 3, as an expert, you really want to start to master persuasion and influence. Some of the best resources and literature on these topics, if you have not read these books, I would absolutely 100,000% recommend adding them to your study list. Remember, we talked about there's tactics, then there's the study, and then there's the spice, and then there is the driver, the who, right? And so to your study, if you're not doing the studying, then you're not going to actually get better and the tactics are not going to work for you. And so one of the best authors on the topic of influence and persuasion is Robert Cialdini. He wrote Influence, Persuasion, and the book Yes. Some amazing, amazing resources. Would highly recommend if you want to actually become the prolific expert and you want the tactics to work, you want to absolutely make sure that you check these out. As well as number 4, make sure you have to care a lot as an expert, as a leader, right? This is a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. He said, "Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care." And so if you're not actually out there to serve, which is, remember, step number 1, you have to decide to serve. If you're not out there to serve and you're out there just to make money, then people are going to be able to smell the commission breath that you actually have, okay? And so that is step number 7, which is all about becoming the prolific expert of your now proven framework. So if you have any questions about step number 7, we talk about influence and persuasion and resources related to that. Any questions about this, please make sure that you actually do let us know if you have any false beliefs around this. But ultimately, if you follow this process step by step by step, then 100% you have earned the right to be at step number 7 in order to be that prolific expert of your framework. All right, gang, let's talk about the ongoing process of creating your framework. So we've already talked about this many times, where really what we're talking about here, and we talk about the 7-step process, is really it's a framework to create frameworks. It's not just a one-time process, right? You are going to be able to go ahead and use this framework to create every single framework that you ever need to create for the rest of your life. Now, what we're going to go ahead and talk about is 2 very important points when it comes to this. Number 1, okay, is being in multiple steps at the same time. When you are actually creating your main framework, right, it's very common, and not only just your main framework, even any framework at all, it's very common for sometimes for you to be in multiple steps at the same time, right? What that means is, like, for example, my wife right now has been working on creating her own main framework. And for those of you who don't know the context, right, my wife and I have been married for 2 years. And then obviously when you live with Coach Yasin for 2 years, now she has a nice cushion, 6-figure corporate job. And she's like, you know what? I want to go ahead and try opening my own coaching business. And so that's what happened. Now, as she's working through making her core framework, she's finding that she's actually like in step 4, step 5, and step 6 at the same time. As she's proving out her framework, she's going out and like creating another framework hypothesis, and then she's testing it on herself, and then like going over here. Same thing, like you might be in finding patterns as well as learning to share, and then still struggling with like deciding to, serve. And so it's very common that you might be in multiple steps at the same time, right? You might even find that you start to become the prolific expert while you're still working with proving out your frameworks with other people. And so that's very, very common. It is fluid. That's going to be a common theme that you notice when we talk about marketing and some of these abstract topics, is that it's not step by step, right? And so you might find yourself being in multiple steps at the same time. It's normal. It is a messy process. That's how art and creativity works. It's never as clear cut as you want it to be. So please don't be a remote control student who expects to be spoon fed and follow blindly. Okay, that's That's point number one. Point number two is that you are going to be going ahead and using this same process to create other frameworks as well as sub frameworks as you go through this, right? So for example, we had created our core framework, which is our 4 pillars of health, right? Nutrition, movement, sleep, and recharge. And then after that, we created another framework that was a sub framework of that, which was the 6 W's of transformation: what, why, who, how, when, and where, right? And then underneath that, we then went ahead and applied that specifically to nutrition. And then we went ahead and underneath that then said, okay, let's go ahead and zoom in on like how to eat. And then we had the 7 tools for conscious eating. And then when we talk about, let's say, for example, how much to eat, right? We had a different framework for that. And so every single time that you have a new framework that you're going to create, it is very much like a cycle, right? It's an iteration cycle that you're going through in order to create new frameworks all the time. And especially if you get good at the skill of creating the visual representations of this, right? You can see I've created hundreds of frameworks over the whole bunch of years. And when I first created my first frameworks, they sucked. And now I have kind of like an artist kind of flame to them, right? Whenever I make these frameworks, whenever we as a team make these frameworks, the colors, I kind of like these specific colors. I kind of stick to them. I kind of know what images I like. I kind of know the tone and how, my own style is of making frameworks. And so that's a skill that you really develop, right? It's literally the exact same process that we went through in order to create the framework for this training, right? When we started creating the framework for this training, we followed these exact same steps, right? And I'm not going to go through them, but I've talked about them in previous training. We followed these exact same steps in order to come up with the framework on how to make frameworks. And so my goal and my hope is that by really us opening the curtain and peeling back the curtain on how this entire world of frameworks works, you can start to have insights and ahas and really go out there and start making your own frameworks. Because like we've talked about before, the better you are at teaching and creating your own frameworks, the more successful you are going to be. And so it is absolutely an ongoing process in order to create your new spice over and over and over again. Okay. And so this was this entire section when we talk about the ongoing process of creating your frameworks, whether that be your spice messaging frameworks, your fulfillment frameworks. You're going to be making frameworks all the time because we are in the coaching education space. And that's how we really get across our ideas as educators, as remote wellness practitioners, as coaches, is through the utilization of frameworks. So I hope that makes sense. And I just wanted to go ahead and make sure that we point all of that out. All right, team, let's talk about the importance of publishing. This is a topic that comes up regularly, and I feel like we haven't done the best job yet in order to make sure that we really emphasize the importance of publishing. We talked about how important it was to publish, namely throughout the entire framework process, throughout the entire spice process, throughout the entire marketing process. Like nothing works without it. And so the goal of this specific training is to go ahead and really, really emphasize the importance of this. Okay, so we're really gonna go ahead and re-emphasize what we're talking about, because what's important to understand is that throughout this entire process, you are publishing. The only thing that changes is the type of publishing that you're doing, right? So like in the beginning, you're kind of publishing about what you're learning. And then over here, you're kind of publishing and externally processing as you start to create your frameworks. And you're talking really kind of like to an audience, or you're kind of talking and externally processing the way that you would with a friend. It's like, hey guys, so today, I've been working on my framework hypothesis, and this is what I'm thinking. And what I'm thinking is I would love to call it this, or I would love to call it this. If you guys have any feedback for me, let me know. Even if there is no audience there, right? You're finding your voice and you're finding your spice in order to do that. And we've gone ahead and included a couple examples of what that looks like, and kind of like, some prompts of what that looks like as well, right? And so overall, when we talk about this, right, it's kind of like, hey guys, so for those of you who don't know, right now I'm working on my awesome new framework for my clients to share in my community. And right now I'm thinking that my framework is probably going to be something around like this, right? But I'm struggling with something like this, right? And so it's really not about publishing is not about posturing yourself as like, hey, I'm a know-it-all, and, I have an ego, and, all this kind of stuff. No, it's all about sharing and being authentic and being vulnerable about what you're struggling with and how the journey is going, right? And then later on, as you get through the process and you're testing and proving out your frameworks, you're sharing that in your journey as well. And so there's a few points that I want to go ahead and highlight in terms of what we've learned from our own coaches throughout the years on the topic of publishing that I think is going to be very helpful for you. Number one is all about the importance of publishing consistently, right? Do you know the percentage of people that actually make it to their 100th episode, their blog post, their video, their podcast, whatever? It's less than 10%. And the percentage of people that post at least 100 pieces of content that end up making a high income later on, it's over 74%. And so really at the end of the day, I remember when I was doing this years ago, right? And that's happened to Coach Malik as well. Coach Malik had a coach who told him, hey, you got to go out there and post do a Facebook Live on your profile every day for 1 year, 365 pieces of content, right? And so what happens is that in my head, I kind of convinced myself that 100 was that magic number. And you can even like go out there and let's say, for example, you have like post-it notes that you write like numbers 1 through 100 on and put them on your wall and like take one post-it note off for every single piece of content that you've published, right? Because 100 is the number where I'm telling you right now, your life is going to absolutely change as you go through that journey of getting there, right? And this same concept applies to pretty much everything that's out there, right? If you think about like the show Game of Thrones a few years ago got really, really popular, went viral. If you think about what percentage of people actually started watching Game of Thrones from the very beginning, pretty much nobody, right? Like very, very small percentage of people, right? But then it actually started getting very popular after like its third season, right? But for the first 2 seasons, barely anybody had even heard about it, right? And so the big thing you want to understand about this is like right now you're not popular, right now you don't have an audience, and that's a good thing because you're finding your voice, you're finding your spice, you're kind of making sure, and right now you're nervous too, right? You're like, I don't know if I could do this, all this kind of stuff. And you quite frankly, for lack of a better term, you suck. And that's okay, you suck, right? You're a beginner, and that's okay that you're a beginner. You're a newbie, and that's okay that you're a newbie, right? Being a newbie is amazing. Sucking at things is amazing, right? Because of the fact that you're actually learning more than you ever will in the history of your career when you actually suck at something in the beginning, okay? But the point is that the more you stick with it, later on you are going to get more popular, and then that way people are going to be able to tune in to the show that is the journey that you are documenting, right? The author Seth Godin, if you don't know him, he's an awesome marketer. He writes some awesome marketing books. He is very generous with his time, and he actually tells people, hey, I will show up on your podcast as long as you make it to the 100th episode. And so the bottom line of this is that if you're not publishing consistently in some way, shape, or form, right? And when we talk about publishing, we're talking about long form publishing, right? Like actually being able to get your ideas and thoughts out there. I'm not talking about like a 1 minute, 2 minute, like 3 sentence, like, hey guys, today's Tuesday. I hope you're doing great. Goodbye. No, I'm talking about like, let's say 1,000-word blog posts if writing is your thing, right? 10-minute podcast episodes, 10-minute YouTube videos, right? I'm not talking about editing and spending all this time doing that. I'm talking about just quantity, straight up quantity in order to actually find your spice and find your voice. If you're not doing that, then you're absolutely going to struggle finding your voice, finding your spice, and really being able to find your people as well. And so if you're not publishing long form content on a regular basis, okay, and making it easy for yourself, and we'll talk more about that here in just a second, I'm telling you right now, you are forever going to stay a beginner, right? And we talk about newbies and beginners and limbic lalus and, 100K coaches and all this kind of stuff. Being a newbie is perfectly fine. It's okay. You're still learning, right? You're trying to find your way. You're trying to find the process. You're nervous. All of that is perfectly fine, right? But once you actually put on the failure uniform, right? You start to have this limbic mental mess, right? This mind mess that's going on, right? You're overthinking and not taking any action. You've crossed the territory into becoming a limbic lalu is what we call it, okay? That's kind of like our term for it. Versus if you want to become a 100K coach and have a winner's mindset, then it's all about being able to take that action. And again, the reason why we say long form is because of the fact that it's going to allow you to really start to find your voice and really start to kind of put ideas together. And then when it comes time for you to, let's say, put together a 30-minute webinar or, a live coaching session for 30 minutes all of a sudden on the spot, right? It's very easy because let's say you did 3 10-minute podcast episodes that week. Well, guess what? You just talk about those same 3 topics back to back, 3 points. That's it. And then all of a sudden you got 30 minutes right there, right? And so it's very, very easy to do once you get to that point because it becomes effortless. Now, does that mean that you have to get to the point of you publishing 10-minute podcast episodes on a regular basis overnight? No, of course not. It's going to take time, right? There's a skill and there's an identity that you have to work on. And there's a results formula. We talk about the results formula equals skill plus identity, right? Skill equals knowledge times reps. Identity equals beliefs times character traits, right? And so you are going to start off completely incompetent and you are absolutely going to be terrible at this. I'm telling you right now, but the more and more reps that you get, the better and better you're going to become. Now, in the beginning, it might just start off with you just talking, but really you want to try and add valuable nuggets over time to what it is that you're publishing, right? That's the goal. If you're just randomly talking about like, hey, I'm going out right now to get lunch and I'm here with my family and it becomes kind of like a vlog, right? That's not as valuable when we're talking about finding your voice and finding your spice. What we're talking about is really being able to put that value around the things that you're learning, your frameworks, the patterns, right? Be able to provide value to an audience. That's going to take time as you're working on becoming the type of person who can do that effortlessly. Okay, so that is point number one that I wanted to share with you in this quick training when we talk about the importance of publishing, which is publishing consistently. Point number two that I want to go ahead and talk to you about right now is all about not creating content, but instead documenting the journey. Because the thing is that you might say, hey, okay, so if I got to publish consistently, Coach Yasin, I got no time to do that, right? And I'm in the same boat with you, right? Like I run a company, I have a family, like who in the world has time to be able to do that, to do an extra additional task in your day, right? But here's the thing. If you make it a part of your day, it becomes effortless and you no longer have to create content. What does that mean, right? Hey, Coach Yasin, what are you saying? Yes, you heard me, right? Instead of you just driving effortlessly, walking around, right, going on your walk, mindlessly doing something else, what you want to do is you want to be documenting the journey. That's what makes it effortless. All you're doing is you're documenting what you're already doing, right? It's kind of like a summary of like, hey, this is what I learned today. Hey, this is what I worked on today, right? This is how I'm able to provide value. And naturally, you're going to find when you talk about your frameworks and how you're creating your frameworks and working with your prospects and working with your clients, you're naturally going to have lessons that you're going to be able to go ahead and talk to the audience about, which in the beginning you might not have an audience, but you're finding that voice of being able to have that audience. And so all you're doing is you're just documenting what you are already doing in providing value, right? Like, hey, I was talking to a client today and this was her problem and this is how I solved it. And I wanted to share that with you guys because I thought you might find it valuable. Boom. 10 minutes, in and out, done, documenting the journey, not creating content. And so it's very much the same way like you would almost talk to a friend or a diary, but remember, we don't want to go into like that vlog world, like, hey, I'm going to go out to get lunch right now, and this is what I'm doing. And it's more about value centered, right? And so the businessman Gary Vaynerchuk, he famously coined the term document, don't create, right? And that's what it is that a lot of people think that, hey, they got to sit down and have some sort of creative orgasm in order to create content, but that's not true, right? The thing is that hunger of you wanting to have that perfect piece of content, what it does is it cripples you and it actually holds you back. It holds a lot of people back and it actually forces them to become from newbies to limbic lallus. And the reason they become limbic lallus is because they become crippled by, hey, I got to create this piece of content that's perfect and all this kind of stuff. No, just document the journey. And as you're going on and learning those lessons, people are going to be able to find value out of that and then build a relationship and a connection with you as well. So don't try to posture or position or put your ego in the way and try to seem like you are something else. Get that all out of your mind, right? What you want to do is you just want to be able to actually show who you are and actually just show the lessons that you are learning along the way and the value that you can provide to your audience. So you want to be raw, you want to be vulnerable, you want to be your true self. And then guess what? That's exactly what Spice is all about, right? Spice is all about learning to be your raw, authentic self because nobody else can compete against you when you are your own authentic self. Because guess what? Nobody can compete against being you. And so you got to change that mindset from trying to be like this expert if you don't feel like you're the expert to really just being that enthusiast. And when you actually do that, then everything becomes so much more effortless because you're not publishing because you know everything about the topic. You're publishing because you are excited and obsessed about the topic. That's the reason why you are sharing. The reason why you are sharing and what you are sharing is all the things that you are geeking out and obsessing over about, whether that be your own frameworks or somebody else's frameworks or your journey or whatever it is. You're like, dude, this is so good of a nugget. I can't hold it only for me. I got to share it with the rest of the world. Okay. And so this is point number 2, which is all about documenting the journey, not going out there and trying to create content. Okay. So that's point number 2 that I wanted to go ahead and emphasize when it comes to creating content. And then point number 3 that I want to go ahead and talk to you about is testing your material. This is the third reason why publishing is so absolutely important. Because here's the thing, when you see somebody who is, let's say, prolific, somebody who is like creative, somebody who is just on it all the time, right? You sometimes see them and you're like, man, how the heck do they just wake up and they're just on it? And a good example of this are like comedians, like stand-up comedians, really good stand-up comedians, right? When you see the Netflix specials and you see them in the arena and they're just like on it with like hundreds of thousands of people. It's crazy, right? They just come up with new jokes left and right. It's one of the hardest things to do, period, is stand-up comedy. It's harder than just public speaking because you got to go on a stadium and actually get people to laugh. It's not easy, right? And then the question that some people have is like, man, how does that person get so good? How does that person so funny? Well, have you ever wondered what the process behind how a comedian actually gets to that point is? There's a really good interview that's on Joe Rogan, right? Kevin Hart's on Joe Rogan's podcast, and we've actually linked it for you inside of the guide if you want to go ahead and check it, and we'll go ahead and link it underneath this training as well, where Kevin Hart really talks about his process, and really not only his process, but he learns this from other great comedians as well, in terms of how they actually perfect their craft and get to the point where they have their voice, they have their spice, right? Because you can't copy jokes from other comedians, right? It has to be something that's unique to you, right? And so what they do and the entire process that Kevin Hart talks about on here is basically effectively what it kind of breaks down to is like, hey, write 10 jokes, go to the local bar, deliver the jokes. One or two of those jokes are going to land, right? Go back to your home or wherever, right? And write another 8 jokes. Now you got 10 again. Go back to the local bar again. And then out of that, another 1 will land. And now you got 3. And then you go back and do that process over and over and over again. And so again, I would highly recommend checking out what Kevin Hart talks about in here, because he does also talk about kind of the becoming process and who he is and who he's becoming. But he basically talks about how it's like, hey, go to random comedy clubs, right? And then what you do is you just basically test your material, right? You got this platform, and you can kind of imagine when he talks about comedy clubs and kind of like going out there and testing your material, for you, that's your platform on Anchor, on your publishing, right? And what he does is he goes out there and he basically just like tests material, right? He'll see like what lands and what doesn't land. And he's trying to get a foundation of like, hey, let's test this story out. Let's test this framework out. Let's test this out. Now, obviously for him, it's jokes. That's what he's testing out as a comedian. But the analogy here is that when you are publishing consistently, it is a platform for you to go out there and test your material, right? Now, if you don't have an audience, you're testing how you say it. Does it flow? You get used to saying it out loud, right? In your community, you're going to go ahead and test it. And what Kevin Hart talks about on here is as things are starting to work, he'll work his way up, right? Before he actually gets to the arena level, he'll test it out at the local comedy club. He'll kind of see how it sounds at that level. And then he'll go to the small theater, and then he'll kind of see how it sounds on that level. And then he'll go to the arena. And then if it doesn't work at the arena, he'll go back to the small theater. And so he's just working his way up to higher and higher levels of platforms. Because here's the thing, even with your own frameworks, even with your own voice, even with your own stories, even with your own messaging, you don't all of a sudden want to go on to like, the news or like have a massive platform where you got to, have millions of people listening to you and you suck. You don't want that to happen, right? If Kevin Hart, when he talks about, he does this every 2 years, okay? Inside of the interview, he talks about how he does this every 2 years, right? If Kevin Hart, right, before he actually comes up with that entire process of going to the local comedy club and then going to the small theater and then going to the arena and then recording the Netflix special, if he doesn't do that and he says, cool, Netflix, I got nothing, I'm just going to kind of wing it, right? What's going to happen on that massive platform in front of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people once it's recorded? He's going to bomb. It's going to suck. And so he has to go through this process of testing his material. And that's what you want to do as well, right? Nobody's listening to you on your podcast episodes right now. You kind of test your material, kind of see how it sounds, the frameworks, get used to talking about it, and then you go into your community, you got your live stream, right? It's a little bit of a bigger audience, right? And then all of a sudden you're running something on an ad, and now thousands of people are going to see it, hundreds of people are going to see it, hundreds of thousands of people are going to see it, and so you're working your way up to higher and higher levels of platforms. And so when you get a higher platform, when you get a big platform, when there's a lot of people listening to you, your material has already been tested. Your frameworks, how you say it, the words that you say, it's already been tested. You know that it's going to resonate with the audience because you've already tested it. So imagine that. Even as famous as Kevin Hart is, right? He still goes to the smaller platforms in order to go out there and test his material before he actually gets to that big stage. And so a lot of people will just wonder like, oh man, that person on the big stage, how the heck did they get so good? Well, what you didn't see was all of the repetition that they were doing in order to perfect their material before they got to the big stage, right? And so this might sound familiar, but it is exactly the same as the iteration cycle that we talked about before, right? You have a hypothesis, and then he goes out there, he takes that hypothesis, and he goes to the local comedy club, right? He gets real world data. That becomes version 2, right? He takes version 2, he goes back to the local comedy club. He does that over and over and over again until he feels that it's ready to go ahead and go to the small theater, right? Then he'll go ahead and expose expose it to the real world again, right? And then he got version 4 from there. And then he'll go to the arena, right? Then the Netflix special. And that's what it is. It's the same iteration process of exposing your hypothesis to the real world, but it requires for you to do the dang work and not just sit on your hypothetical, theoretical hypothesis. You actually have to go out there and put in the work to expose what it is that you think to the real world, because here's the thing, you're going to pretty much be wrong every single time until you actually expose it to the real world and get the data from that. And so this is what publishing allows you to do when you do it consistently on a regular basis, is that Anchor app is kind of like your local comedy club where you're practicing and listening to how things sound and kind of seeing how it resonates and finding your voice, right? It's kind of like your lab where you're testing concepts and ideas and see what flows and all of that kind of stuff, right? And then as you test your material, as your episodes start to get traction, you can then start to see, hey, this really resonated with the audience. Hey, this didn't really resonate with the audience. You can kind of see, hey, what is actually sticking out? And then you know what the market likes and what the market doesn't like. And so just like Kevin said in that interview, he said that even the material that he thought was good, he was always so surprised when it doesn't take off. And guess what? That's the exact same way with everything. And so that way, when you're testing your material by publishing consistently, when it comes time to be able to create your ads and you write your VSL or you do your live stream or you do your webinar or you go on an interview or you go on somebody else's podcast, everything just flows so smoothly because you've said it a gazillion times. You've tweaked it a gazillion times. You know what resonates. You know what's going to hit. You know exactly how the audience is going to respond. So because you've tested it and put in the reps, and so the more you publish, the more you will be able to go ahead and test your material, and then ultimately the clearer that your message is going to become, and the more people that you are going to attract throughout that entire process. And so this is the reason why I wanted to make sure that we could touch on these points so that way we could really start to emphasize all of the important reasons why publishing and finding your voice and having your platform is so absolutely critical throughout this entire process, regardless of if you're a beginner, if you're already somebody who's making income throughout this process. Publishing consistently is going to be the ticket that is going to be the platform, not necessarily always to find clients from. Yes, it could be an aspect of lead generation, but more so around your spice and being able to stay prolific and on the cutting edge as you are sharing things out loud. So that is the importance of publishing. I hope you got value out of that. If you have any questions about anything that we spoke about inside of this training, do make sure that you let us know. With that being said, this is Coach Yasin checking out, and I will catch you inside of the next training. Hello, come all and come everyone. Welcome to the Spice Framework Action Steps training. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. Of course, action step number 1, as always, is to make sure that you watch and study this training in full, including all of the sections. Very, very important. Okay, action step number 2 is going to be all about the different steps, okay? You want to, number 1, decide what area of life you want to create a framework in. Step number 2, you're going to go ahead and learn an insane amount and share all of that inside of your publishing. Step number 3 is that as you're learning and sharing, you're going to be taking notes of the patterns that you are finding. Again, remember, all of these specific instructions are located inside of the actual training, okay? Step number 4 is you're going to go ahead and create a framework hypothesis with a visual image. If you are not having some insight about, hey, what's the framework I want to have? What does a spice look like? That means that you need to make sure that you are completing the previous steps properly, okay? Step number 5 is to test the framework on yourself. Step number 6, to prove the framework out with others. And then step number 7 is to go ahead and become the prolific expert of your framework. Again, for a thousandth time, all of these specific instructions are inside of the actual training. You want to make sure that you are following them, okay? What you're going to go ahead and do with action step number 9 then is you're going to go ahead and submit your spice framework work, okay? Just as always, there is a comment box underneath this. You want to make sure that you do not delete the hashtag because that allows all of the comments to show up specifically underneath this training, so it keeps everything nice and organized. The title of this is going to be Spice Framework Submission. That is what it's going to look like right there. Again, just how I've been doing here inside of the Spice messaging module, there are going to be 2 parts of this, okay? You have struggles and questions at the top, if that is applicable to you, and then the second part is going to be the actual submission, okay? What this is going to look like, hey, I completed my Spice Framework hypothesis, attached is an image of it, okay? And so when you went ahead and designed your image for your Spice Framework, probably in Canva, because that is what we recommend, end, you're going to go ahead and actually attach the image of it. My thought process of how I created my SPICE framework was, we want to know, hey, what was your thought process? Where was your mind at, right? I went through all of the steps, and what I learned was, my biggest takeaway was, my thoughts about this were, right? You want to go ahead and give us your thoughts on that as well, okay? So this is what that template looks like. Again, we are going to be going ahead and including that template underneath the description for this training, so you can just go ahead and copy and paste it, and then just go ahead and edit it. And then, of course, the hashtag is going to be something that you don't touch. Very, very, very important. And if you don't have any questions or struggles, go ahead and let us know, and you don't got to include that first part on there, okay? Of course, we have talked about being organized, conscious, and deliberate in your writing. Please, please, please go ahead and make sure you are using enter and space and everything properly, so that way you can be properly organized on there, okay? Very, very, very important. In terms of tech tutorials, make sure you are using hyperlinks if you are going to be sharing hyperlinks. And then if you are sharing links, or when you are sharing links, make sure you are changing the permissions on them as well. In this submission, there's not going to be that many links, but if there is, just saying, hey, use the proper etiquette for that, okay? Couple points on here. Let's put the nail in the coffin. 3 rules. Number 1, how to ask for feedback. Number 2, this is a community, not gurus. And number 3, it's a two-way street. Ask one and give one. Remember, do not just say, hey, here's my SPICE framework. Looking forward to your feedback, thoughts, and comments. Somebody's not going to be able to have anything. They don't have any substance to be able to say, yeah, I think that's good. I think this is great. I love this. Like, you're not just looking for feel good, random kind of just, random comments. No, you're looking for something that is actionable and specific, right? So that's why you want to do empowered asking. Now, guess what? That is going to mean that you are going to have to expend some energy to think ahead of time, which is the way empowered asking works. The human limbic mind doesn't want to use that energy, but that is why you're going to fight the human limbic mind and be conscious about it. Hey, I am struggling with, okay, when it comes to my SPICE framework, the potential solutions that I have already done the homework on to come up with are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Out of those 6, which solutions do you think would be best? Go ahead and pick one and let me know your thoughts on it, right? And so you've done the work ahead of time to actually empower not only yourself, but also the person to be able to help you in the best way possible, okay? So again, if you're not struggling with anything, you can go ahead and let us know as well. Please don't just revert to, hey, give me your feedback, thoughts, and comments, okay? That is not helpful, so please do not do this, okay? Rule number 2 is, this is a community, not a bunch of gurus, okay? Ain't no gurus on the mountain here, okay? All the community members have just as much insight as the coaches do on this. And so you're gonna get more feedback when you actually tailor your questions to ask the entire community. The power is in the community. And then rule number 3 is two-way street, ask one, give one. And so if you ask from an empowered state, remember, very important, if you ask, you wanna go ahead and go over to somebody else and give your 2 cents on that as well. Because remember, we are a community and the power is in the community. And so when you give, you will get more in return. That is how abundance actually works, okay? So this has been the action steps for the SPICE framework. Let us know if you have any questions. Make sure you are using all of the templates and everything we talk about. With that being said, really excited to go ahead and see your submission. This is Coach Yassine checking out, and I will catch you inside of the next training.